Hamilton sends a strong message to Ferrari after a strategy disaster. Lando's secret to a dominant Zandvoort victory has been revealed, and Verstappen reacts to a crash in the race. Let's get into the latest F1 news. Lewis Hamilton went to Ferrari to win championships. That was the whole point. The fresh start, the scarlet car, the legacy-defining move. And then Zandvoort happened, and suddenly every single question mark that followed him from Mercedes showed up uninvited to the party at Ferrari as well. What you are about to hear is not just a race breakdown. This is the story of a strategy failure that cuts right to the heart of what Ferrari's season actually is right now, and more importantly, what it means for Hamilton's future at the team. Because here is the thing that most people are getting wrong about this situation. Everyone is framing this as Hamilton being frustrated. As if frustration is the story. It is not. The frustration is just the symptom. The real story is the strategic pattern underneath it, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. We are going to break this down in 4 parts today. First, we are going to look at exactly what happened at Zandvoort, moment by moment, decision by decision, because the details matter here more than you might think. Then we are going to zoom out and look at Ferrari's strategy culture and why Hamilton specifically is exposed by it in a way that his teammate is not. After that, we are going to get into what Hamilton actually said, because his words were carefully chosen and they reveal something far more significant than a driver just venting after a bad Sunday. And finally, we are going to talk about what this all means going forward, because we are in a very specific window of the season right now where these kinds of strategic failures compound, and the implications for Ferrari's title ambitions are genuinely serious. Stay with me through all of this, because the final piece is where it gets really interesting. Let us start at the beginning. Zandvoort, the Dutch Grand Prix. A circuit that is already one of the most difficult places on the calendar for strategy calls because overtaking is genuinely difficult. The track is narrow, tyre degradation can be unpredictable, and the timing of safety cars and virtual safety cars tends to scramble everything on the pit wall. Hamilton arrived there in a Ferrari that has shown real pace at various points this season. Not always the fastest car on track, but genuinely competitive on the right weekend. The Dutch Grand Prix should have been one of those weekends, or at least a point-scoring opportunity that kept Ferrari in contention. What unfolded instead was a masterclass in how a strategy department can take a driver with potential race pace and simply hand the advantage to someone else through the decisions made on a pit lane radio. Now here is the mini reveal that most coverage is missing entirely. The issue at Zandvoort was not one bad call. It was a sequence of connected decisions that each individually might look defensible but together created a cascading effect that cost Hamilton significant ground. The most frustrating type of strategic failure in Formula One is not the obvious blunder. The obvious blunder is easy to identify and even easier to move on from. No, the most damaging kind is when each individual call has a logic to it, but the cumulative result is catastrophic for the driver. That is what happened here. And that pattern, that specific pattern, is one that Hamilton experienced repeatedly during certain difficult spells at Mercedes. And the fact that it is showing up now at Ferrari in his first season with the team should be setting off alarms in Maranello. The common mistake people make when analyzing race strategy failures is they focus entirely on the timing of pit stops in isolation. They look at when the car pitted, compare it to when competitors pitted, and draw a straight line between the two. But that misses the wider decision-making framework. What tyre was Hamilton on heading into the critical phase of the race? What was his relative pace compared to the cars around him at that point? What information was Ferrari's strategy team working with about the degradation curve? And crucially, were they making calls that prioritized Hamilton's race or were they playing a different game entirely, perhaps protecting a strategic option for his teammate Charles Leclerc? Those questions are the ones that cut to the core of what actually happened in the Netherlands, and they are the questions that Hamilton himself has been asking, perhaps not always out loud but certainly in his communications with the team. Ferrari's strategy culture is something worth examining in real depth here, because it is central to understanding why Hamilton's frustration goes beyond just one race. Ferrari has historically operated with a dual-driver approach that sounds balanced in press conferences but in practice creates moments where one driver's race is sacrificed, sometimes subtly, sometimes not so subtly, for the benefit of overall team positioning. Now during Charles Leclerc's time at the team alongside Sebastian Vettel, and then later alongside Carlos Sainz, there were numerous examples of calls that seemed to favor one side of the garage depending on the championship situation at any given moment. Hamilton arriving at Ferrari is not walking into a neutral environment. He is walking into a team that has deeply established strategic instincts, and those instincts were built around a different driver being the primary reference point. Here is the part that is genuinely fascinating though. Hamilton knew this going in. He knew Ferrari's history. He knew the complexity of joining a team that already had a beloved #1 driver in Leclerc who has grown up professionally within the Ferrari system. The bet Hamilton made was that his experience, his racecraft, and his sheer ability to extract performance would cut through all of that. And on pure speed, there have been moments this season where that has looked like a reasonable bet. But strategy is not just about speed. Strategy is about trust. It is about the team's willingness to build their in-race decision-making around your specific tyre behavior, your specific feedback loops, your specific racing instincts. And that trust takes time to develop. Hamilton is in his first season at Ferrari. The team is still learning his tendencies. He is still learning their systems. And at Zandvoort, that gap in established trust showed up in the most visible possible way. When Lewis Hamilton speaks after a race where he is unhappy with strategy, there is always a translation exercise required. He is a 7-time world champion. He has been in Formula One for nearly 2 decades. He knows that saying the wrong thing publicly creates a bigger problem than the original strategic miscall. So his language is deliberate. When he described his feelings about the Zandvoort strategy as frustrating and suggested that the team had not made the right calls for his race, that is Hamilton being measured. Those words, delivered in that tone, after that specific race, are the equivalent of a pressure gauge hitting the red zone. Anyone who has followed his career closely knows that. The people in the Ferrari garage know that. The question is what they do with that signal. The micro contrast here is important. Most drivers, when they talk about strategic frustration, are essentially expressing emotion without a solution framework. Hamilton's frustration is different because it comes packaged with very specific analytical observations. He does not just say it was wrong. He tends to identify, at least internally and sometimes in coded public language, precisely which decision point was the pivot. At Zandvoort, the sense from his communication was that the timing and nature of his pit strategy left him in a position where he was effectively racing against his own car's limitations rather than genuinely competing with the drivers around him. That is an entirely different kind of frustration to just ending up in traffic through bad luck. What makes this moment so significant in the broader arc of Hamilton's first Ferrari season is the timing. We are deep enough into the year now that patterns are becoming clear. A bad race in the first 4 rounds could be written off as a new team learning phase. A strategic misstep this far into the calendar is harder to dismiss as growing pains. And for Ferrari, who have genuine championship aspirations and have been competitive at various points this season, these are the races where you simply cannot afford to waste your assets. Hamilton is an asset. When you have a driver of his caliber in a car capable of fighting for positions in the top 5 or better, and your strategy calls effectively neutralize that potential, you are burning resource that you cannot get back. There is also a wider psychological dimension to this that deserves attention. Hamilton made one of the most scrutinized career decisions in Formula One history when he chose to leave Mercedes for Ferrari. The entire narrative around that move was built on the idea that Hamilton still had something to prove, that he wanted one more championship shot, and that Ferrari represented the most dramatic possible path to securing that legacy. Every race where things go wrong feeds into a counter-narrative. Every strategic failure gives ammunition to the people who question the move from the beginning. Hamilton is acutely aware of that. You can hear it in the careful way he navigates post-race media. He wants to express legitimate frustration without letting it become a story that overshadows the team's relationship or his own resolve. That is an exhausting tightrope to walk, and the fact that he is walking it while also trying to integrate into a new team at this stage of his career makes the Zandvoort situation even heavier than the raw race result suggests. Let us talk about what Ferrari needs to do now, because this is not a moment to simply move on from. The Dutch Grand Prix is done. The points are gone. But the strategic conversation that needs to happen within that team is not just about reviewing what went wrong on that specific Sunday. It needs to be about something deeper. It needs to be about how Ferrari builds its in-race decision-making framework around both of its drivers with genuine equality, rather than defaulting to established instincts that may subconsciously prioritize one side of the garage. That is not an accusation. It is a systemic reality that any team with 2 strong drivers has to actively work against. The teams that manage it best are the ones who build very deliberate protocols for how decisions get made in real time under pressure, with clear lines of accountability and clear communication back to both drivers about the reasoning behind each call. Hamilton's value to Ferrari is not just his qualifying pace or his race pace or his ability to extract performance from a tyre in ways that genuinely surprise even experienced engineers. His value is also his 20-plus years of strategic experience. He has been on the receiving end of thousands of strategy calls. He knows what good looks like. He knows what the data should be telling the pit wall at any given moment. Ferrari would be wise to leverage that knowledge rather than create conditions where it becomes a source of friction. The payoff of this whole situation, and it is a real payoff because there is a genuinely positive path through it, is that teams which navigate this kind of tension productively often come out significantly stronger. The conversation that a frustrated Hamilton forces within Ferrari's strategy department could, if handled well, be exactly the kind of corrective pressure that sharpens their decision-making for the remainder of this season and into the next. Championship-winning teams are not teams that never make mistakes. They are teams that learn from mistakes faster than their competitors do. Ferrari has the raw ingredients. They have the car pace on certain weekends. They have 2 elite drivers. What they need is the strategic clarity to stop tripping over their own feet when races get complicated. The remaining races this season matter enormously, not just for the points table but for what they tell us about Ferrari's trajectory and about whether Hamilton's move to Maranello is building toward the legacy moment he envisioned or drifting toward a footnote that will be replayed in documentary series for decades. Right now, the story is still being written. Zandvoort was a painful chapter. But it does not have to define the rest of the book. What is crystal clear is that Hamilton has not arrived at Ferrari to accept mediocre strategic support. His career has always been defined by his refusal to accept ceilings that others have set. Whether that is technical ceilings, competitive ceilings, or the cultural ceiling of a team's existing habits. The fact that he is applying that same relentless standard to Ferrari's strategy department is not a problem. It is exactly the right pressure at exactly the right time. The question Ferrari has to answer is not whether Hamilton is being too demanding. The question is whether they have the organizational courage to evolve in response to that demand before more points slip away on Sundays that should have been theirs to take. And there is one more layer to all of this that genuinely keeps this conversation alive. Hamilton's contract situation at Ferrari and what his long-term presence at the team looks like is not purely a matter of points totals and championship standings. It is also a matter of whether Hamilton feels that the environment around him has the potential to produce what he came there for. Strategic failures like Zandvoort are data points in that assessment. Not decisive on their own, but cumulative. Every driver has a threshold. Hamilton's threshold is higher than almost anyone in the sport. But it exists. And Ferrari's pit wall would do well to remember that. If you found this breakdown useful, there is another video sitting right there that goes deep on Ferrari's overall season trajectory and what the second half of the year actually needs to look like for Maranello to turn their potential into real championship arithmetic. Lando Norris just handed us a masterclass, and almost nobody is talking about the part that actually mattered. Not the overtake. Not the fastest lap. Not even the championship points. The thing that genuinely decided the 2026 Dutch Grand Prix was something so quiet, so behind the scenes, that most casual fans completely missed it. And when Lando himself revealed it after the race, it reframed everything we thought we knew about how modern Formula One races are actually won. Here is what blows my mind about this. Everyone watching that race at Zandvoort was focused on the on-track battle. The passes, the tyre degradation, the pit wall calls. That is where most fans, most pundits, and honestly most analysis channels put all their attention. But Lando Norris, when he sat down and explained exactly what happened, pointed to something that had been building for weeks before the Dutch Grand Prix even started. Something that most people would never even think to look for. And once you understand it, you cannot unsee it. Every race you watch from this point forward will look completely different to you. This is not about raw pace. McLaren clearly has a fast car in 2026. That is not the secret. The secret is in the psychological and strategic layer that Lando and his team have been quietly constructing all season, and at Zandvoort it all came together in a way that was almost surgical. We are going to break down exactly what happened, why it worked, and what it tells us about where Formula One is heading as a sport. So here is what we are covering today. First, we are going to dig into the actual revelation Lando made after the race, the specific detail he pointed to as the turning point. Then we are going to break down the strategic execution that surrounded it, because the decision itself was only part of the story. After that, we are going to zoom out and look at what this win means for the championship picture, because the implications are massive and the timing could not be more critical. And finally, we are going to talk about what the competition needs to do to respond, because right now McLaren has an edge that is not just mechanical, and that is genuinely fascinating. Stick with me through all of this because the payoff at the end changes how you look at this entire season. Let us get into it. So what did Lando actually say? After the race, speaking to media at Zandvoort, Norris was asked to pinpoint the moment the race was won. And he did not talk about a particular lap, a specific overtake, or even tyre strategy in the way you might expect. He talked about confidence. Specifically, the confidence he had going into the race weekend to push the car in a way he had not been able to earlier in the season. He described it as a kind of freedom, a feeling that the relationship between himself and the car had reached a new level of trust. And what that unlocked was the ability to commit to lines and braking zones that simply were not available to him before, not because the car was not physically capable, but because the mental alignment between driver and machine had not been there. Now here is the thing most people get wrong when they hear something like that. They hear it as a generic confidence quote, the kind of thing drivers say to sound thoughtful in post-race interviews. But that is a massive mistake. When you actually listen to how Lando described this shift, the specificity of it is striking. He was not talking about a vague feeling of being more relaxed. He was talking about a very particular technical dimension of his driving, specifically the way he was able to trail brake deeper into corners at Zandvoort, a circuit that punishes hesitation brutally, and extract more rotation from the rear of the car without triggering the instability that had been costing him time earlier in the year. What Lando was describing, if you translate it from driver speak into engineering language, is that something changed in how the McLaren behaves under that specific type of driver input. And the question is, what changed? Was it a car setup evolution? Was it a development update that finally clicked? Or was it genuinely the driver himself finding something new in his own technique? Because each of those answers has completely different implications for what McLaren can sustain going forward. The honest answer is probably all three, and that is exactly why this is so significant. When a driver, a car, and a set of aerodynamic and mechanical parameters all converge at the same moment, the performance uplift is not additive, it is multiplicative. You are not just getting a slightly faster driver plus a slightly better car. You are getting a completely different performance ceiling, because the driver can now access parts of the car's capability that were previously off limits. And at Zandvoort, which is one of the most technically demanding tracks on the calendar precisely because it rewards that kind of committed, aggressive driving style, that convergence hit at absolutely the perfect moment. But here is where the story gets even more interesting, because Lando did not get to that point by accident. And this is the part of the narrative that almost nobody in mainstream coverage picked up on. The psychological and developmental journey that brought him to that level of car confidence at Zandvoort was not spontaneous. It was built deliberately, across multiple race weekends, through a process of incremental trust building between Norris and the McLaren engineering group. Every time he gave them feedback about where the car felt uncertain, they responded. Not always immediately, not always perfectly, but consistently and directionally. And that consistency created something that is actually quite rare in Formula One at the sharp end of a championship fight, which is a driver who completely trusts that his engineers are listening and acting. Think about what that trust does to a racing driver's psychology in a pressure situation. When you know that every concern you raise is being taken seriously and responded to, you stop managing risk in your driving. You stop holding a small amount of performance in reserve as a buffer against uncertainty. You commit fully, because you have evidence from experience that the support structure around you is reliable. That is not a soft, touchy-feely observation. That is a performance variable that is as real and measurable as downforce or tire temperature. And at Zandvoort, it showed up on the timing screens in a way that was undeniable. Now let us talk about the strategic execution that surrounded this revelation, because even with all that confidence and driver-car alignment, the race still had to be managed. And this is where McLaren's pit wall deserves enormous credit, because the decisions they made on race day were not conservative. They were aggressive in a way that only makes sense if you are absolutely certain of your driver's ability to deliver. The tyre strategy they ran was predicated on Lando being able to protect his rubber in the first stint without sacrificing lap time, which is genuinely one of the hardest technical asks in contemporary Formula One. Managing tyre temperature while maintaining race pace at a circuit like Zandvoort, where the high-speed corners load the tyres constantly, requires a level of precision that separates good drivers from championship-caliber ones. And Norris delivered. He managed that first stint with a control that looked almost effortless from the outside but was, by his own description, one of the most demanding things he had done in the car this season. Every lap was a calculation. Push enough to stay in the strategic window, not enough to generate the kind of heat that would compromise the tire's structural integrity before the pit window opened. It is the kind of driving that does not get highlight reels, but it is the kind of driving that wins championships. The pit stop itself was clean, the call was well timed, and what emerged from that pit window was a Lando Norris who had a car with fresh rubber and that same psychological freedom we talked about earlier. The combination was devastating. The lap times he produced immediately after that stop were at a level that made it clear to everyone on the pit wall, his competitors included, that this race was over. Not because nobody else was trying, but because Norris in that moment had reached a state of performance where the gap between him and everyone else was simply too large to close on one tyre stint. Here is the thing about what McLaren is doing this season that is worth paying very close attention to. The mistake most people make when they analyze Formula One is they look at the championship standings and they look at the car performance metrics, and they try to project forward from those two data points. But that approach completely misses the momentum dimension. And momentum in Formula One is not just psychological, it is structural. When a team goes on a run of strong results, they accumulate resources in every sense of the word. Financial resources, yes, but also confidence within the organization, clarity in development direction, and most crucially, data. Every race weekend where everything comes together teaches you more about your car than 10 race weekends where you are fighting fires. McLaren is currently in a phase where they are learning at an accelerated rate. The Dutch GP win was not just important for the points it put on the board. It was important because it validated a whole series of developmental decisions and driver coaching strategies that the team had been executing for months. It told them, specifically and unambiguously, that the direction they are heading is correct. And that kind of validation accelerates everything. The next development update gets green-lighted faster. The setup philosophy gets refined with more confidence. The driver's feedback gets integrated more quickly because the engineers know it is trustworthy. For Lando personally, this is a pivotal moment in his career narrative. There has been a persistent question hanging over him, one that was never entirely fair but that existed nonetheless, about whether he could perform at the absolute limit when the championship pressure was at its most intense. The Dutch GP was not just a race win. It was a direct answer to that question, delivered on one of the most demanding circuits in the world, against competitive opposition, with the championship stakes at their highest. The manner of the victory, the controlled aggression, the tyre management, the mental clarity he demonstrated throughout, all of it pointed to a driver who has genuinely reached the next level of his development. Now, the championship picture. The points Lando banked at Zandvoort tighten things up in a way that changes the calculus for every team on the grid. The remaining calendar has specific characteristics that matter here. There are circuits coming up that favor different car attributes, and the way McLaren and their nearest rivals approach those weekends is going to be shaped by what happened in the Netherlands. For McLaren's rivals, the Zandvoort result is not just a points loss. It is an information update that forces a strategic reassessment. They now know that Norris and his team have reached a performance level that cannot be handled with conservative strategy. You cannot just manage your own race and hope McLaren makes a mistake. You have to attack, and attacking carries its own risks. This is the kind of position McLaren has been working to put their rivals in all season. Not by being flashy or unpredictable, but by being relentlessly consistent and raising their performance floor to a level where everyone else is perpetually chasing. Zandvoort crystallized that dynamic in a way that the standings alone did not fully capture. And the response we see from the competition over the next few race weekends will tell us a huge amount about who has the organizational depth to actually mount a challenge. What does the opposition actually need to do? This is where it gets really interesting, because the answer is not simple and it is definitely not just about bolting on a new front wing. The advantage Lando described, the confidence advantage, the driver car alignment advantage, that is not something you can copy with a technical upgrade. You have to build it. And building it takes time, consistency, and exactly the kind of organizational patience that is genuinely hard to maintain when you are under championship pressure and your rivals just won convincingly at Zandvoort. The teams chasing McLaren need to look honestly at their own driver-engineer relationship dynamic and ask whether their driver has the same level of freedom and trust that Norris described. If the answer is no, then the gap on paper is probably smaller than the gap on track, and that is actually a more dangerous situation than a straightforward performance deficit because it is harder to see and harder to fix. You cannot identify it in CFD data. You cannot measure it in a wind tunnel. It lives in the quality of conversations between a driver and his race engineer over a race weekend, in where the feedback is genuinely acted upon versus politely acknowledged, and in the cumulative history of those interactions over an entire season. What Lando and McLaren have built is essentially an organizational advantage that expresses itself as a performance advantage. And that is the hardest kind of advantage to close down quickly. It is also, for fans of genuinely competitive racing, the most fascinating kind to watch unfold in real time. Because unlike a straightforward car performance gap, which is visible and quantifiable, this kind of advantage is invisible right up until the moment it decisively shows up on track and suddenly everything makes sense. The Dutch Grand Prix gave us a window into something that has been quietly assembling itself inside the McLaren operation for the better part of this season. Lando Norris did not just win a race at Zandvoort. He demonstrated a convergence of preparation, trust, technical confidence, and psychological readiness that represents a genuinely elite level of Formula One performance. The revelation he shared after the race was not a soundbite. It was a description of a system working exactly as intended, with every component aligned toward a single purpose. And what makes it remarkable is that from the outside, watching those lap times drop across the timing screens, it looked almost inevitable. That is how you know it was real. The best performances in any sport have that quality. They look like they could not have gone any other way. But only because an enormous amount of invisible work made them possible. If you want to go even deeper on how McLaren has been building this momentum across the full 2026 season and what the next few races could look like for Lando's championship challenge, the video right next to this one breaks it all down race by race. Do not miss it. Max Verstappen stood in the paddock at Zandvoort, visibly shaken, and said something that almost nobody in Formula One expected to hear from him. And when you actually understand what happened at the 2026 Dutch Grand Prix, you will realize this moment tells you everything about where Formula One is right now, where Verstappen is mentally, and why this race weekend was genuinely one of the most dramatic and consequential days the sport has seen in years. Here is the thing that most people are getting completely wrong when they talk about what happened at Zandvoort. They are treating this like just another crash, just another unfortunate racing incident that gets filed away in the history books and forgotten by the next race weekend. But that framing completely misses the point. What happened at the Dutch Grand Prix was not just a car hitting a barrier. It was a collision of pressures, personalities, circumstances, and championship implications that revealed something much deeper about the current state of Formula One. And Verstappen's reaction, the words he chose, the tone he used, tells you more about the psychological warfare happening inside this championship battle than any lap time data ever could. Right now, in August 2026, we are at a pivotal inflection point in this Formula One season. The championship standings are tight, tensions between the top teams have never been higher, and every single race weekend carries enormous weight. What Verstappen said after this crash did not happen in a vacuum. It happened at a moment when the pressure on him has been building race by race, week by week, and the Dutch Grand Prix was supposed to be his fortress, his home crowd, his moment of redemption on the season. Instead, it became something else entirely. So here is exactly what we are going to break down today. First, we are going to walk through exactly what happened during that crash at Zandvoort, the circumstances, the moment of impact, and why it unfolded the way it did. Then we are going to dissect Verstappen's reaction word by word, because there is far more hidden in what he said than the headlines are giving him credit for. After that, we are going to zoom out and look at what this crash and his response mean for the broader championship picture heading into the second half of the season. And finally, we are going to talk about something nobody else is discussing, which is the psychological dimension of a driver like Verstappen responding publicly the way he did, and what it signals about his mindset going forward. Stay with me because the final piece of this is genuinely surprising. Let us start at the beginning, because to understand Verstappen's reaction you have to understand the full weight of what Zandvoort means to him. This is not just any race. The Dutch Grand Prix is the race where tens of thousands of orange-clad fans pour into those narrow, banked, coastal sand dune grandstands specifically to watch Max Verstappen win. The atmosphere at Zandvoort is unlike anything else on the Formula One calendar. It is loud, it is intensely personal, and it creates a kind of expectation that sits on Verstappen's shoulders the moment the weekend begins. He has won there before, he knows the track intimately, and his fan base treats it almost like a national event. So when things go wrong at Zandvoort, they do not just go wrong on a racetrack. They go wrong in front of everyone who matters most to him, in the place where failure feels most visible and most raw. Now here is the part that most casual fans completely overlook when analyzing crashes in Formula One. A significant crash during a race weekend is never just about the physical event. At the level Verstappen operates, every crash is processed through multiple simultaneous layers: the physical reality of what just happened to the car, the immediate emotional response, the championship mathematics that instantly start running through the mind, the team communication pressure, the media pressure that begins the second the car stops moving, and the crowd that is watching all of it in real time. Most people only ever see the crash footage and maybe a brief post-race comment. They miss the extraordinary cognitive and emotional load that is happening in the cockpit and in the moments immediately after. The crash at the 2026 Dutch Grand Prix sent shockwaves through the paddock because of both the nature of the incident and the timing within the race. Verstappen found himself in a situation where contact occurred, the car suffered significant damage, and what had been shaping up as a critical race for his season was suddenly over. For a driver racing at Zandvoort, in front of his home crowd, at this specific stage of a tight championship, the word catastrophic is not an overstatement. The points implications were immediate and painful. And here is where his reaction becomes genuinely fascinating, because the mistake that most people make when hearing Verstappen speak after an incident like this is they expect rage. They have been conditioned by years of motorsport drama to anticipate the moment where a driver points fingers, fires off blame, and uses the post-race media session to go to war with whoever they feel is responsible. That kind of reaction gets clips, it gets views, and it confirms the narrative that high-pressure sport creates explosive personalities. But Verstappen did something different at Zandvoort, and the nuance in what he actually said reveals a driver who is operating at a far more psychologically sophisticated level than his critics give him credit for. When Verstappen spoke after the crash, he acknowledged the severity of what happened without spiraling into the kind of uncontrolled emotional response that the cameras were clearly hunting for. There was frustration, absolutely. You could hear it and see it. This was a man who just watched a home race fall apart around him. But underneath that frustration was something else, a kind of measured clarity about what the incident meant and what had to happen next. He did not pretend it was fine. He did not downplay the damage to his championship hopes. But he also did not unravel. Think about what that actually takes. You are sitting in a car that has just hit something hard, your race is finished, your home crowd has gone quiet, the championship mathematics have just shifted against you, cameras are already in your face, and every word you say in the next few minutes will be quoted, clipped, analyzed, and broadcast to millions of people worldwide. The psychological discipline required to navigate that moment while still being authentic and not robotic is genuinely extraordinary. But here is the open loop that we need to sit with for a moment, because something in Verstappen's reaction hinted at a deeper concern than just this specific race. There was a quality to the way he spoke that suggested this crash was not just painful in isolation, but that it landed on top of something that had already been building. And to understand what that something is, we need to look at the bigger picture of where this championship actually stands right now. The 2026 Formula One season has been one of the most unpredictable in recent memory. The new technical regulations that came into effect created a more level playing field than anyone inside Red Bull Racing would have been comfortable with. The dominance that defined the previous era has been replaced by a much closer, more volatile competitive environment where race wins are genuinely contested by multiple teams. For Verstappen, who built his identity and his legacy on a period of near total supremacy, adapting to a season where every point is a battle requires not just driving skill but a fundamental recalibration of how he approaches race weekends. The mental model that worked when your car was almost untouchable is not the same mental model you need when margins are razor thin and every retirement hits differently. This is why the Dutch Grand Prix crash stings so deeply and why his reaction carries so much weight. When you are fighting for a championship from a position of strength, a retirement hurts but it is manageable. When you are fighting from a position where the gaps are narrow and every race result matters enormously, a retirement does not just cost you points. It hands momentum, confidence, and psychological advantage directly to your rivals. And there is a very real psychological cost to that transfer of momentum that does not show up in any standings table. What Verstappen did in his immediate reaction was actually a masterclass in managing that psychological cost in real time. By not exploding, by not giving his rivals the spectacle of him losing composure in front of his home crowd, he protected something that is arguably more valuable than the points he lost. He protected his aura. The story of Verstappen over the last several seasons has been built on the perception that he is unshakable, that setbacks make him sharper, that adversity sharpens his focus rather than blunting it. Every word he says after a bad result either reinforces or undermines that narrative. At Zandvoort in 2026, he reinforced it. There is also something incredibly telling about the specific language patterns he used when discussing the crash. Rather than positioning himself as a victim of circumstances or attacking the situation externally, he spoke with a directness that kept the narrative focused on what comes next rather than dwelling in what just happened. That is not accidental. Drivers at the highest level of Formula One work with performance coaches and psychologists who help them develop exactly this kind of language discipline, because the way you narrate an incident to the media becomes the way your entire team narrates it internally, which then shapes how the team responds to you in the next race weekend. Leaders who speak with forward momentum generate forward momentum from the people around them. It is a genuinely powerful dynamic. Now here is what this all means for the championship picture, because this is the part where the stakes become crystal clear. With the crash at Zandvoort, the gap in the standings either closed, widened against Verstappen depending on what his rivals managed to do during that same race, and the psychological weight of losing points at your home event heading into the final stretch of a season carries a specific kind of gravity that is different from any other kind of loss. The Dutch Grand Prix was supposed to be a momentum builder, a confidence booster, a chance to demonstrate that he could dominate on home soil the way he has done before. Instead, it became a test of resilience. And this is actually where I think the most important story of the entire weekend is hiding. Not in the crash itself, not even in the immediate reaction, but in what happens in the weeks that follow. The races coming up on the Formula One calendar after Zandvoort are going to be telling. Because how a driver processes a race like this, how they convert the pain and the frustration into focused energy rather than desperate aggression or withdrawal, determines so much about whether a championship fight swings in your direction or away from it. Verstappen has been in these situations before and come out stronger. That history matters. It matters to him, it matters to his team, and it matters to the sport's narrative. But 2026 is a different chapter. The cars are different, the competition is different, and the version of Verstappen we are watching now is not the same version who dominated in the years before. He is adapting in real time to a more difficult environment, and how he manages moments exactly like the Dutch Grand Prix crash will define whether this season ends in triumph or in the particular kind of pain that comes with fighting everything you have and still falling short. What his reaction at Zandvoort told me, and I think it told anyone watching closely, is that he is still fighting with everything he has. The frustration was real, the pain was visible, but the composure underneath it all was equally real. That combination, raw emotion held together by genuine discipline, is what separates the drivers who are simply talented from the ones who become legendary. The Dutch Grand Prix of 2026 may end up being one of the most important moments of Max Verstappen's entire season. Not because of the crash itself, but because of what came after it. Because sometimes the most revealing thing about a champion is not how they perform when everything goes right, but how they stand up, look into the cameras, and choose their words carefully when everything has just gone spectacularly wrong. And if you want to understand what else is shaping this extraordinary Formula One season, what the other pivotal moments have been and where this championship could still go from here, the next video is going to take you even deeper into everything that is happening behind the scenes in this most unpredictable of Formula One years. What if I told you that one of the most talented drivers on the Formula One grid right now is being absolutely robbed by something completely outside his control? Not a lack of skill. Not a strategy blunder. Not even a teammate battle. Just pure, ruthless, almost cinematically cruel bad luck. And the worst part? It keeps happening over and over again to the same guy. Oscar Piastri. The 2026 Dutch Grand Prix. Another race weekend that should have been a defining moment. Another chapter that ended in frustration. And after it was all over, Piastri himself stood in front of the cameras and said what everyone watching already knew. This keeps happening. And it needs to stop. Today we are diving deep into exactly what went down at Zandvoort, why Piastri's bad luck streak is becoming one of the most talked about storylines in Formula One right now, and what this all means for his championship ambitions. Because make no mistake, this is not just a one-off. There is a pattern here, and it is starting to raise some very serious questions about whether fortune will ever truly smile on this kid. So let us start from the top. Going into the Dutch Grand Prix, Oscar Piastri was in a genuinely strong position. McLaren had been on a superb run of form through the middle part of the 2026 season. The MCL car had been quick across multiple circuit types. Piastri himself had been delivering the kind of performances that remind you why McLaren invested so heavily in locking him into their long-term plans. He was sharp, he was consistent, and heading into one of the most unique circuits on the calendar, Zandvoort, the expectation was that McLaren could be right there at the sharp end. Zandvoort is a fascinating track. It is narrow, it demands precision, and overtaking is notoriously difficult once the field settles. That means qualifying matters enormously at this circuit. It also means that if something goes wrong at the wrong moment, the consequences tend to be race-ending rather than just time losing. There is very little room to recover. The circuit essentially punishes misfortune in a way that few others do. And then, Of course, misfortune arrived. Now the specific details of exactly what happened to Piastri during the Dutch GP weekend paint a picture that is becoming frustratingly familiar for his supporters. A situation developed that was outside his control, the kind of thing that no amount of preparation, no amount of talent, no amount of racecraft can protect you from. It cost him significant points. It cost him what could have been a genuinely strong result. And perhaps most painfully, it was the latest in a sequence of similar moments that have chipped away at his championship campaign. Piastri himself was characteristically measured when he spoke about it afterward. He did not throw his helmet. He did not launch into angry tirades. He is not that kind of driver. But read between the lines of what he said, and you can hear the frustration building. He acknowledged the bad luck. He acknowledged that it keeps coming back. And he pointed to the painful reality that this is becoming a recurring theme in a season where he genuinely deserves better. That restraint, that professionalism, is actually one of the most compelling things about Oscar Piastri as a character. Because here is a driver who came through the junior ranks as an absolute machine. 3 consecutive championship titles in Formula Renault Eurocup, Formula 3, and Formula 2. Nobody in the modern era had done that. He arrived in Formula 1 after one of the most dramatic silly season storylines in recent memory, that entire Alpine situation where a seat he had been promised collapsed in spectacular fashion, and he handled that with composure beyond his years. Then he arrived at McLaren as a rookie and immediately looked at home. Year after year he has developed. Year after year the lap times have come. Year after year the racecraft has become sharper. By 2026, he is not a promising youngster anymore. He is a serious Formula 1 driver who legitimately believes he can win a world championship. And the evidence supports that belief. Which is exactly why the luck situation is so maddening. There is a concept in sport that gets discussed a lot, especially in motorsport, around the idea of deserved versus actual outcomes. Sometimes the best performance on a given day gets the result it deserves. Sometimes it does not. And when you zoom out across a season or across multiple seasons, a certain amount of statistical averaging tends to occur. The bad luck balances out. The random elements level the playing field over time. But sometimes, for certain drivers during certain stretches, the randomness just does not cooperate. The safety car comes out at precisely the wrong moment for them and the right moment for someone else. The mechanical issue surfaces after a dominant performance. The incident happens at the corner they happen to be navigating when everyone else gets through cleanly. It is not conspiracy. It is not targeting. It is just probability playing out in the cruelest possible way. And Oscar Piastri appears to be living inside one of those streaks right now. Let us think about the championship picture for a moment, because context matters enormously here. Every point in Formula 1 matters. The difference between finishing second and finishing fourth is 7 points. The difference between finishing on the podium and retiring from a race you were running well in can be 15, 18, 20 points depending on where you were running. Those gaps accumulate. Those gaps, across the course of a season, can be the difference between a world championship and a near miss that haunts a career. History is absolutely littered with drivers who looked back on seasons where the luck went against them and recognized that those were the years they could have won. Sterling Moss never won a world championship despite being one of the fastest drivers of his era, and bad luck was a defining part of that story. Nigel Mansell in 1986. Damon Hill in 1994, though that one had more going on. The point is, in a sport decided by points accumulated race by race, being robbed consistently by circumstances beyond your control is not a minor inconvenience. It is potentially career-defining in the most painful way. For Piastri in 2026, the clock is always ticking. He is young, yes. He has time, yes. But championship windows are not infinite. They depend on having the right car, being at the right team at the right moment, and getting the fortune to convert performances into points when they count most. McLaren right now appear to be in a strong enough position to genuinely compete for honours. That window might be open for several more years, or it might close faster than anyone expects. These things are unpredictable. So every race matters. Every Dutch Grand Prix matters. Every moment of bad luck is not just a disappointment in isolation but a potential dent in something much larger. Now let us also talk about Lando Norris for a moment, because you cannot discuss Piastri without acknowledging the dynamic within McLaren. These are two genuinely quick drivers competing within the same team, and that creates a complicated internal arithmetic. When Piastri loses points to bad luck and Norris does not, the gap between them within the team changes. When the reverse happens, the situation flips. But when you zoom out across 2026 so far, if the pattern of bad luck has been hitting Piastri more consistently than his teammate, that is a narrative that writes itself. Not through any fault of either driver, just through the mathematics of misfortune. And there is a psychological dimension to this too. McLaren have to make decisions throughout a season about how to deploy resources, how to approach race strategy, who to prioritize in specific scenarios. Those decisions are often influenced by championship position. If bad luck has artificially deflated Piastri's standings relative to where his pure performance deserves him to be, that can create situations where the team's strategic priorities do not fully reflect his true capabilities or potential in that season. It is a cruel cycle. The bad luck hurts the position. The position then influences decisions. The decisions potentially compound the damage from the bad luck. Piastri, to his enormous credit, seems to understand all of this and continues to deliver at a high level regardless. That mental resilience is not accidental. It is built through years of performing under pressure, through the junior Formula experiences, through the bizarre drama of his arrival in Formula One. He has been tested in unusual ways for a driver his age, and he seems to have developed a genuinely thick skin for adversity. But even thick skin has limits. And bemoaning the bad luck publicly, even in measured and professional terms, tells you that the frustration is real and it is building. What can he actually do about it? That is the honest and difficult question. The answer, somewhat unsatisfyingly, is mostly just keep performing. Keep qualifying well. Keep executing on race day when the opportunity presents itself. Keep making sure that when the luck does turn, and statistically it should turn, the position is there to capitalize fully. Do not compound the bad luck with bad decisions. Do not let the frustration translate into overcooking a corner trying to recover lost time. Stay clean, stay focused, and trust that the mathematics eventually rebalance. It is easier to say than to live. But watching Piastri operate, you genuinely believe he is capable of sustaining that mentality. There is also the team dimension here. McLaren need to be looking at this pattern and asking hard questions about reliability, about the specific circumstances that have been catching Piastri out repeatedly. If there is any element of the bad luck that is systemic rather than purely random, any element that comes from processes or preparation or decision-making that can be improved, then identifying and addressing that is crucial. Not just for Piastri's sake but for McLaren's championship ambitions as a constructor. Formula One teams at the top level operate with extraordinary sophistication. They model scenarios, they war game strategies, they stress test processes constantly. If Piastri's bad luck streak contains any pattern that their analysis can identify and mitigate, you can be sure they are working on it. Whether they have found it yet, whether the Zandvoort situation pointed to something identifiable or whether it was just pure random chaos, we do not fully know from the outside. What we do know is that Piastri himself has now publicly flagged the issue. And in the world of Formula One, where drivers often speak in carefully managed corporate language, him saying plainly that this is a recurring problem is notable. It is a signal. It is him, in his measured way, applying pressure, saying to his team, to the world, this needs to change. Let us also step back and appreciate something about this situation from a pure storytelling perspective, because Formula One is as much a story as it is a sport, and the Piastri story is genuinely compelling. Here is a driver who did everything right in the junior categories, won everything available to win, handled an extraordinarily difficult political situation with remarkable maturity, arrived in Formula One and justified every bit of the hype, developed season on season into a genuine title contender, and now finds himself at what should be a peak moment, racing for a strong team in a car capable of winning, and getting repeatedly knocked sideways by fortune. That tension, between exceptional talent and frustrating circumstance, is the engine of the most memorable sporting narratives. We love watching athletes overcome adversity. We are drawn to the story of someone who keeps getting knocked down and keeps getting back up. And Piastri, whether he is thinking about it in these terms or not, is living that story in real time in 2026. The Dutch Grand Prix was another chapter in that story. Another moment where the result did not match the performance. Another post-race press conference where he had to process publicly the gap between what should have happened and what actually did. And another demonstration of the quiet determination that makes him such an interesting driver to watch. The question the remaining races of 2026 need to answer is whether this is the year the story pivots. Whether this is the season where the luck stops being a recurring antagonist and the talent gets to take center stage without interference. Whether Zandvoort was the last in a string of disappointments before a run of results that rightly reflects what Piastri has been delivering all year. Because here is something worth remembering. Every race that passes where Piastri is still in championship contention despite the bad luck is actually a testament to how strong his baseline performance has been. If a driver can keep themselves relevant in a title fight while simultaneously dealing with a string of fortune-related setbacks, that tells you something very significant about the quality of the racing they are delivering when things do go right. The points he has scored have come the hard way.
No gifts.
No capitalizing on someone else's misfortune when he was not in position to deserve it. Just clean, consistent, high-quality Formula One driving that has kept him in the picture even while the universe seems to be testing his patience. That is the foundation. That is the platform. And when the bad luck eventually does rebalance, when the random variables stop conspiring against him and start distributing their chaos more evenly across the grid, the points that follow are going to come fast. Because the speed is already there. The racecraft is already there. The mentality is already there. Right now, Oscar Piastri just needs the sport to stop being quite so creatively hostile toward him for a while. And honestly, if you have been watching this season at all, you want that too. Because the version of this championship where Piastri is fully represented by his actual performance level, where the luck factor is neutral rather than antagonistic, would be one of the most fascinating title fights Formula One has produced in years. The talent is absolutely there. The car is competitive. The team is capable. Strip away the bad luck and you have a genuine championship contender. Add the bad luck back in and you have the story we have been watching unfold, which is compelling in its own right but leaves you constantly thinking about what could have been. After Zandvoort, Piastri will reset. He will analyze what went wrong and what can be controlled. He will talk to his engineers. He will look at the next circuit on the calendar and start preparing. That is what top-level athletes do. They do not dwell. They process and they move forward. The rest of the 2026 calendar still has enough races to change everything. Enough points still available for the championship picture to shift dramatically. Enough opportunities for Oscar Piastri to convert his raw speed and racecraft into the results that his performances have been consistently earning. The bad luck cannot last forever. It statistically cannot keep hitting the same driver at the same intensity indefinitely. The numbers do not work that way. At some point, the tables turn. At some point, the safety car comes out at the right moment for Piastri instead of the wrong one. At some point, the clean air goes to him instead of away from him. At some point, a rival makes an error that he benefits from rather than him being the one caught out. When that moment comes, and it will come, the question will be whether Piastri is still close enough to the championship to take full advantage. Whether the points damage from this run of bad luck is recoverable. Whether the gap that misfortune has created can be closed by the talent that misfortune has been suppressing. I genuinely believe the answer is yes. I believe Piastri has the quality to mount a serious challenge in the second half of this season if the luck just gets out of his way. And I believe that the Dutch Grand Prix, for all the frustration it delivered, will eventually be remembered not as a disaster but as part of the backstory to something significant. At least, that is what every Piastri fan is desperately hoping right now. If you are invested in this story, subscribe and hit that notification bell because we are going to be covering the rest of this championship fight as it develops, and I have a feeling the most interesting chapters are still ahead. If you think I missed anything about what happened at Zandvoort or you want to share your thoughts on whether Piastri can still turn this season around, drop it in the comments below. I read everything and I genuinely want to know what you think. This championship is not over. Oscar Piastri is still in it. And if the bad luck finally backs off, Formula One is about to get very interesting indeed.